Let's get to it out of the gate. I think that there are some justifiable concerns among conservatives about some of the stuff happening in the tech space and social media, censorship, and regulation. But I'm also deeply worried that conservatives, a lot of them now have this mindset that we need a solution to come from government, completely ignoring the fact that one day Democrats will be in charge of all this power we want the FCC and the FTC to have again.
I think you're totally right to be concerned about that. You know, there are, I think, real concerns that people have expressed about bias in content moderation, who's making decisions, how are they happening. And those are good conversations to have. But just because you've identified a problem doesn't mean that government has the solution to it. And
Amen.
And there's a real risk of us falling into this trap of thinking that things can be centrally planned by just the smartest group of bureaucrats if we can just get them in the right room in DC. And that, I think, is just a recipe for disaster. Here's, I talk to folks all the time about this issue. It's something that I care about. It's something that all the groups in our organization work on. There are, 97 Democrats running for president these days. Many of them on stages in lots of places. And, of course, the president's running for re-election. Here's the test that I use. If you picture in your mind the candidate that you most disagree with, the person you really don't want to see elected, and you picture in your mind the issue that just drives you nuts every time you hear them talking about it, and you're comfortable with that person on that issue setting the terms for online debate, then yeah, we should look to DC for a solution here. We should look to a federal technology speech commission to tell us what the rules for online debate should be. But if that gives you pause, if you only like that solution when your guy's in charge, if you only like that solution, if you happen to agree with the people on the policy issue that's being debated or the cultural issue that's being debated or whatever's being debated, then you're just setting yourself up for long-term failure after failure of being disappointed and being silenced.
Well, in that regard, though, I think there's some legitimate concern among conservatives that frequently when it comes to social media, particularly on some platforms who are not sponsoring this event, for example, I had my account on Twitter suspended for 24 hours for saying that Elizabeth Warren was going to introduce the Wampum Act, Wrecking American Prosperity, and I forget what the rest of it, but Wrecking American Prosperity with Marxism Act, the Wampum Act. It apparently insulted her based on her ethnicity. Well, how? She says she's not even a Native American. But my account was suspended for 24 hours. I would note that you also have Louis Farrakhan's account has yet to be suspended for calling Jews roaches.
Yeah, right. So, and I bet you we could sit here all day and list the examples of things that are frustrating or annoying. The question is, what do you want to do about it, right? And so there's a temptation, and it's a real one that, quite frankly, unfortunately, you hear from the left and the right, to say, just because we've thought of this new problem, we need some new rule to deal with it. We have laws in this country that exist. We have laws that ban fraud. If a company tells you, here's the agreement we're getting into with you, and here are the promises we're making to you, these are the terms of the bargain, and then they do something else, we have laws against that. Fraud is not legal, right? And nor should it be. But the idea that we need some sort of new federal censorship commission, that's going to improve the situation in online speech is frankly wrong. And we know that because, quite frankly, we've tried this before with radio. So when radio launched in the early 1900s, you had a whole bunch of people from a whole bunch of different backgrounds, many of whom with really strong political views. Folks on the right and on the left. You had labor organizers and, in fact, community groups and churches all running radio stations. And by the early 1920s, you started to get the three-letter call sign stations that were building up this network. And by 1926, you started to have the first series of network of radio stations, which lets folks like you broadcast all across Georgia, not just on the one station you're at. And there was a politician who started getting really worried. And he started getting really worried because suddenly one person from somewhere in the country could speak to lots and lots of people very quickly and with no intermediaries and with no one sort of checking what was going on. That politician was Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover at the time was Secretary of Commerce, and so he got together with his friends, a couple of whom were powerful US senators, and they passed 2 bills in 1927. And what those bills did was set a federal licensing regime for radio, and they set equal time rules. And effectively what it did was it made it impossible to run radio stations that had opinionated content, that had controversial content. And so what you got over the ensuing decades, from basically the 20s until 1987 when it was repealed by the Reagan FCC, was a fairness doctrine. And what the fairness doctrine resulted in was only stations that had sort of relatively broad, non-controversial entertainment programming were able to broadcast. But if you wanted to actually state your opinion, if you wanted to go out and advocate, if you wanted to build an audience of people of like-minded values, that was impossible. And we suffered through this 60-year span of government-imposed censorship. And it wasn't the type of censorship that says, okay, you can say A but not B, right? This side of the issue but not that side of the issue. It was the type of censorship that said, no one can have strongly held political beliefs. It's just not the type of business you can run. And what we've seen since that repeal in 1987 is an explosion in diverse, loud, engaged political voices. Like, Eric, your show could not exist prior to these rules. And what is shocking to me is after one of the greatest deregulatory accomplishments of the 20th century, liberalizing the airways in a way that allowed people to express their views, we're now here in 2019 debating whether we need to impose basically the same system for the internet. It's nuts.
Yeah, it absolutely is, I think. And yet you have a lot of people who look at social media and technology companies and say, well, there are a bunch of liberals from San Francisco running liberal companies, hiring liberals, they all hate us, so we're going to get censored. When a lot of data shows that conservatives are at parity or better on social media, even with our liberal corporate overlords, supposedly. How do you view this issue, though, and address the conservative concerns that, well, they really are out to get us on these social media platforms?
So here's what I'd say. I'd say 2 things. The first is, if you look in a given day on what the top news sources are on Facebook, you'll see that it's Fox News and Daily Wire and overwhelmingly right-of-center concerns. And as someone who often shares those views, I think that's great. Even if it weren't true, I still think the idea of the government coming in and telling a private company who you can and can't do business with is wrong. If we believe, as a movement, that a cake baker in Colorado can't be compelled to use his expressive talents in designing wedding cakes to make a cake for a gay couple when it violates his religious conviction, then Facebook gets to decide if they bake the cake or not. And quite frankly, it's really disappointing to me that so many folks on the right have decided that the appropriate solution here is to have what David French called the daddy state government come in and tell these companies to stop being mean to me instead of doing something about it, right? And to be clear, there are real problems here. So I want to give you a concrete example. One of the things that Senator Hawley, who's been pushing a lot of these, from our perspective, pretty bad ideas, has been vocal about, is he's worried about the impact on children and families. And that's fair. That's totally fair, right? We, for the first time, have a generation of people in this country who are raising children, and their kids are coming to them, and they want to have a conversation about how long should my child be using a cell phone for? Is screen time a problem? Is online bullying a problem? And how do I deal with that as a parent? And what's new is, unlike other types of parenting questions, it's not like you can go and ask your parents, hey, how did you deal with this 30 years ago when I was growing up? I say this as a soon-to-be father of a baby girl who's been thinking about these issues. And so, that's a real challenge. But just because you've identified a problem doesn't mean there's a government solution. So one of the things that we've been supporting through the Charles Koch Foundation is a partnership with a group called the Family Online Safety Institute. What they've put together is a program called Good Digital Parenting. You can go and Google it or, DuckDuckGo it, and you can find Good Digital Parenting online. And what it is 7 simple steps for parents on how to talk to their kids about using technology. right? So just because there's a governance question, how do we want to deal with cell phones in our children's lives, doesn't mean that we have a government problem.
Well, I mean, and just to clarify here, I don't actually talk to my children anymore. I just text them because it's honestly. So we flat out in our family drew the line with our kids not having cell phones. So 13 and 10, they don't need a cell phone. And I took my daughter on an overnight trip to Atlanta. We live an hour south of here. Came up here. We were staying overnight. Had 3 girls in the car with me, and none of them were talking to each other. They were texting each other in the car. There was no noise. My daughter in the front was having to talk to them.
You're saying this is a bad thing or a good thing?
No, but my daughter in the front was having to talk to them because she couldn't text, and I realized she is being shut out of her entire circle of friends because she doesn't have a device that can text. It's like, I guess I need to loosen up a little bit on this because, and it's just, you're right, it's not something we had as kids because we didn't have these texting screen devices, but now she's really mad because she can text, but I'm taking advantage of the technology myself to block certain websites and to use the built-in screen time on the iOS devices from Apple, and it certainly works, and I don't know that we need a government solution. I do personally continue to have the concern. Well, one, I would say, I know people who build their entire businesses reliant on either a Facebook or a Google or a Twitter or what have you, and I don't think we should surrender the foundations of a business to another company that may change its rules or algorithms or what have you. But at the same time, I maintain there is a real level of concern when you hear some of the stories that come out of Silicon Valley and whatnot, when you see even employees at some of these companies, even Amazon, for example, deeply upset that the companies are doing business with the government, that there are clearly people who don't like conservatives who work there. And I also want to rein in the conservative impulse of, well, we own the government right now, we should go after them, because one day you're not. Look at what happened with the IRS and the Tea Party groups.
Yeah. I thought Vice President Pence yesterday said it best when he said that we should have faith in the American people to see through the noise and choose freedom, right? I can't guarantee you that every outcome you you would prefer in the marketplace is going to come to be. I can't guarantee you that businesses that you favor are going to succeed and thrive. I say this, by the way, full disclosure, as a former employee of Blockbuster, right? Things change in the marketplace. But I do really worry about the government coming in and saying we know best. So one other sort of historical example. How many folks in this room have heard of Edwin Armstrong? Okay, so 2 hands. So Edwin Armstrong, who liked to be called Major Armstrong, was a chronic inventor. He invented all the time. He was served in the US Army in both World War I, World War II, and so when he went back to Columbia as a physics professor, would like to be called Major Armstrong. In 1934, Edwin Armstrong strapped his new invention to the top of the Empire State Building, and he invented FM radio. And what FM radio solved at the time, and especially in the 30s, was that AM signals, when the thunderstorms would roll in, would get super staticky. And the breadth of audio sound that can be transmitted over AM was not as wide as wideband FM. And so jazz didn't sound as good. In fact, he sort of very famously put on this demonstration when he was marketing this technology, where he came in with an AM set and an FM set and played the same jazz song on both. And you could just hear the vibrancy of the tone on FM radio. And these things started selling like hotcakes. So in the 30s, about 500,000 Armstrong radios were sold in the United States. And these were very expensive at the time. And you had stations, primarily in the Northeast, starting to pop up. And it was a wave of innovation in popular communications and audio technology. Well, some folks in Washington, D.C. didn't like it very much. And so right at the end of World War II in 1945, they invented this thing called the sunspot theory. So it was basically a nonsense excuse that solar flares would interfere with FM signals in a way that they wouldn't interfere with AM signals. But it was just a pretext, right? They didn't like his new technology because you had all of these new stations and all of these new people suddenly being connected. And And they didn't tell him exactly he couldn't do it. What they did was they moved all of the spectrum that had been allocated to FM radio to an entirely different part of the dial. And so suddenly, overnight, 500,000 radios stopped working. You had really, really expensive paperweights. And Armstrong's life starts to go into a tailspin. He gets into a big fight with RCA. And by 1954, he commits suicide. And it's because the government came in and decided to pick winners and losers in the marketplace and protect incumbent AM broadcasters over this FM competitor. And it wouldn't be until about a decade later in the 1960s when FM radio really started taking off in the United States. And so what you had was a 3-decade delay in better audio signal and more people being able to listen to the music that they want. Contrast that with the way the iPhone rolled out, right? Where you had spectrum controlled by private entities, where you had Apple being able to come out with a, quite frankly, like once-in-a-generation consumer product that puts a super computer in so many of our pockets, and within, quite frankly, like a very short time span from invention to deployment, you have a product that is now, at least in the United States, relatively ubiquitous. That doesn't happen if you have to go to the government and say, "Mother, may I?" That doesn't happen if you have to prove that, absolutely the iPhone is better than the old BlackBerries or the old flip phones. And the truth is, the iPhone's not the only phone in the market, right? Like there are plenty of other devices made by other manufacturers, and different consumers are going to have different preferences, right? What is right for your daughter and your family might not be right for my daughter and my family, and that's okay. That's the difference between a top-down government-imposed solution that says Washington knows best and here's how technology needs to evolve, versus a bottom-up approach that, as Vice President Pence said, puts faith in the American people that they will choose freedom.
In that regard, one of my other concerns in this sphere, in addition to I do think conservatives have some legitimate angst, at the same time, I notice a lot of technology companies are embracing the idea of regulation, and my concern is they embrace regulations, the regulations are written anticipating them, thereafter no new person can come up and David can no longer take out Goliath because Goliath has built the regulatory structure to protect himself.
It's deeply dangerous, and it's something we work very actively at the state level in 36 states and at the federal level to oppose. Regulation benefits incumbents, period, full stop. The biggest fans of complex, burdensome regulatory regimes are big companies because they can hire the lawyers and they can hire the lobbyists and they can hire the accountants and they can deal with it, and you end up building a regulatory moat around your business. At the same time, there's a lot of fear-mongering about size, and I just want to put this in context, right? Because often when you and I have this conversation, with folks have this type of conversation, someone will just come up and say, and I anticipate someone after this panel coming up to me and saying, but Google's just so big, but Facebook's just so big, they're so powerful, surely this time is different. And the truth is that if you look at the advertising market, which is where those two companies tend to compete, internet-based advertising is large. Right? It's about 40% of all advertising. But when you look at it as a share of advertising and marketing, it's much smaller, right? It's about 18%. And why do I say ad-in marketing? Well, because the inherent business model in digital advertising is I've got a message or a product and I want to get it in front of a consumer. And so I have some piece of information about that consumer, and I'm going to put my message in front of them, and that's how I'm going to reach them, right? That's how a Facebook ad works. That's how an ad on YouTube works. It's also, by the way, how direct marketing works. It's how mailers work, right? When a product company buys shelf space at Walmart and wants Tide Pods at eye level, so you see them as you're walking down the aisle, that's very similar to having a digital ad on your phone in a prominent place. So you see that Tide Pod and you click buy and add it to your Amazon cart. And so, yes, companies are large. That's why we have competition enforcement. Yes, companies should be honest with consumers about what the terms of the deal are. That's why we have laws against fraud. But the idea that we need some special new law just because the business model has evolved a bit or the technology has evolved a bit is a recipe for stopping innovation in its tracks. Because the folks who are best equipped to see that competitive threat coming and go lobby their favorite regulator are the folks who have the old technology, not the new upstart.
Well, I think a great example of this is the internet sales tax, that for years, it was the major big box stores wanted the internet sales tax because they thought it would hurt Amazon. The moment Amazon got big enough, Amazon's like, hey, we want the internet sales tax because we don't want mom and pop shops to get online now that the cost of doing business online has gone down.
And this is where consumer choice, so you're totally right. And when Amazon put warehouses close to people to provide near like 1 day or 2 day delivery, they suddenly had tax obligations in all of these states, so they didn't mind everyone else being competed with. Look, when I want to go buy toilet paper, Amazon's a great place to do it. Boxes show up at our house all the time. When I want to go find something that's a little more unique, something that's a little more crafty, quite frankly, Amazon's not a great place to do that. There are lots of small retailers around the country and around the world, and some of them use the same digital marketing tools that we've been talking about to reach out, but others of them use Etsy and Pinterest and other platforms. And you know what? As a consumer, sometimes I just want the box of the big brand stuff that I know exactly what I'm getting, and sometimes I want something that's different. And both of those things are good, right? In some sense, what we're having is not an economic debate. We're having a moral debate. Folks are saying that people in government in DC know better than you about how to make buying decisions with your own money. They're saying that they know better than you about how to make reading decisions about what news content you want to read. And I keep going back to the line that Mike Pence said yesterday, but he's absolutely right about it, right? Like, this is about whether or not you value individual choice and individual responsibility. So if the internet, and then I'll end my little rant, but if the internet has taught us anything, it's that, humanity, warts and all, can be reflected online just as it can offline. And you know what? Sometimes people are terrible to each other, and they do awful things, and they bully people and they harass people, and that's been going on playgrounds long before Twitter was around. And when we take that conversation online, a lot of the same problems that happen offline happen. And so I'm not intentionally being Pollyanna-ish, right? It's not like there's nothing wrong on the internet. The question is, when people are terrible to each other on the internet, who do you want to hold responsible? And I think individuals are responsible for their actions, and not the tools they use.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And to go full circle in our conversation, it troubles me greatly that conservatives could look like they're getting a win here when they're actually surrendering because they're imposing regulations that, God forbid, Elizabeth Warren were to get elected president, what would she do? I mean, look at the Obama administration and Tea Party groups and the IRS. Now suddenly you have the FCC. Being a guy in radio, having the FCC reimpose the equal time rule because they don't like conservatives. The Democrats have been trying it forever. And now they target social media companies in a way that no one can ever grow and compete and build a new social media enterprise because the existing ones are under regulation, but also you've got Democrats in charge of them saying, oh, no, this conservative really, his account did deserve to be banned, and this progressive over here did not.
Yeah, if the next time you hear a politician with an R after their name saying they have this great new idea for how to regulate speech online, for how to regulate the development of technology, for how to regulate the internet, substitute in Elizabeth Warren or your favorite Democrat, and if you're still comfortable with the plan, then we just have a legitimate disagreement about policy, and we can have that argument. But if you only like it when your guy's in office, you're just setting yourself up to be disappointed, and not just disappointed, to be meaningfully curtailed in your freedoms.
Well, and, I want to say that I do recognize some of the moral concerns that people like Senator Hawley and others are raising on these issues, and the great unknown now, and the fact that I do think there are a lot of companies who have invested a lot of time to understand psychology to ensure that we stick around. But I also think that if we're giving the government our parental duties, we're ceding the ground to the government to tell us how to be parents and how to regulate our kids' time on the internet. One of the great examples of this is my daughter's 13. She loves photography, she loves art. She wanted an Instagram account 2 years ago, and I was okay with her having an Instagram account as long as it was private, as long as all of our family followed her so we would all be able to monitor and see, and as long as we approved each person who followed her account. Those were the ground rules. Well, I did not realize that I, as a parent, had to lie to Instagram to create the account, because the government has this Child Online Privacy Protection Act where parents have to do certain things if your child is younger than 13. And the way social media accounts interpreted that to keep themselves out of trouble is, if you were under 13, you cannot have a social media account. So my 10-year-old who wants to play on the Xbox with friends over the internet can't, unless we lie about his age. My daughter, who wanted a private Instagram account, couldn't unless we lied about her age. And what's that teaching my kids? That dad is lying about their age so that they can do this thing that I, as a parent, am perfectly comfortable and capable overseeing and monitoring.
So I want to thank you for admitting before this large audience that not only have you been lying to the tech companies, you've probably committed federal felonies.
Oh, totally so.
Like,
happy to do it
I'm
online.
not joking, by the way, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, if you want to look it up. Right? And it's something we just take for granted all the time. And it's the exact manifestation of, if you turn to Washington to raise your kids, if you turn to Washington for parenting advice, you're going to get these top-down rules that say, over 13, okay, under 13, here's this bureaucratic system that no one wants to comply with. And it's not that there shouldn't be special protections for children. There should be. I think that's a reasonable place for the government to have some limited role. But the problem is that when you create these sort of complex regulatory regimes, you either get what you just described, which is everyone basically ignores it or fudges around it or enters the wrong birth year or something like that. Or you get just real stymied innovation in products that, the market for 10-year-olds to 13-year-olds is very different than the market for 15 to 18-year-olds. And it would actually be good if we had companies that were thinking about those products instead of just saying, you know what, the government's made it too hard, under 13 you can't just sign up.
Well, as a parent, as someone who thinks about conservative philosophy, I also think that there is a danger inherent in these things where we lose respect for the rule of law when we see so often the laws are designed in a way that we have to break them in order to live laws that make no sense. You devalue the regulatory structure and the legal structure.
So there's a great book by Harvey Silverglate. Who's a criminal defense lawyer up in Boston, who's the co-founder of FIRE, which is a terrific organization that advocates for free speech rights on college campuses across the United States. And Harvey Silverglate wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day. And the basic argument in the book is the average American unwittingly commits 3 federal felonies a day. And not only, so I agree with you that it devalues a respect for the rule of law, which is important. It also meaningfully empowers government to sort of hang a sword of Damocles above your head, right? Because if everyone is guilty of a crime at some point throughout the day, then if they want to get you on something else, you've raised Lois Lerner in the IRS scandal a couple of times, there's always something out there for a creative prosecutor. There's this story that used to be told about the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York that the senior prosecutors would take the junior prosecutors out to drinks. And the game was one of the senior prosecutors would name a celebrity, and then the junior prosecutors had to come up with the most creative crimes they could theoretically charge them under. And that should scare all of us. At the end of the day, this debate is a microcosm of a broader discussion. And I sort of want to leave this here. For basically all of human history, until about the year 1800, people's lives from their great-grandparents to their great-grandchildren, in terms of the quality of life that they lived, was basically flatlined. If you looked at life expectancy, if you looked at technological innovations, if you looked at what people lived on in a day, per person, per capita, per day consumption, what it cost to live in real terms was $3 a day. And in the last 200 years or so, there has been an explosion of growth. So worldwide, that number is up 1,000% in terms of what the average person lives on in a given day. And in developed countries like the United States, that's up 3,000%. That literally lifted billions of people out of poverty. So what changed around 1800? What changed around 1800, and there are all these sort of like pop social science books, and some people will say it was salt, it was coal, it was rule of law, it was institutions, all of these things played a role. There was a cultural shift that happened. Deirdre McCloskey, the economist, talks about it in terms of we started inventing. If you had called someone an innovator 300-400 years ago, it was basically a synonym for a heretic. Galileo was an innovator. Didn't end particularly well for him. An innovator meant someone who challenged the power and the orthodoxy of the state, and were usually swapped down. There's been just a swing of the cultural pendulum over the last 200 years where innovation, discovering new things, finding ways to better your life and better someone else's life as a result, is now something that we embrace as a culture. And one of the things that I worry a lot about is that we're starting to lose that. Because I think the types of things that have improved people's lives in medicine, in transportation, and being able to stay in touch with friends and family, in being able to maintain connections, beyond just the small town in which you live, those things require two things. It requires a culture that embraces innovation, and it requires a policy environment that allows for lots and lots of experimentation, because most of the new ideas suck, and they'll fail. And that's good. That's how we find the ones that work. It's that dynamism and experimentation that allows us to seize on the next great invention. And that's the reason why I care so much about standing up to top-down government solutions and standing up for the rights of people to try new things and try and see what they can come up with next.
Jesse Blumenthal, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.